through there! Get him through there! Hold that corner! Stay where you are!
The streets of the UK have turned into a battlefield as massive pro-Palestine protests erupt into violent clashes with the police.
So they are definitely concerned about the fact that the West proclaimed to be, these humanitarian, and the West having non-barbaric and authoritarian.
Huge tensions explode in the UK as pro-Palestine supporters and police go head-to-head. Shocking scenes grip the UK as the worst law and order situation arises with furious police and protesters.
Why should the public keep paying for police time when a foreign war has nothing to do with us? Peter, surely this is draining police resources.
It very much is, and out of that more than 1,000 police officers deployed this afternoon, many of those will have been drawn away from policing their local communities, neighbourhoods, boroughs, investigating crime, preventing crime and serving victims. But they're dragged away to central London.
Scenes of unrest grip the UK as pro-Palestine demonstrators refuse to back down, forcing law enforcement into a brutal standoff.
Peter Beskley has described the group being a mob, while today there were 13 Holocaust survivors and survivor descendants who have written an open letter opposing the ban to the national demonstration taking place outside the BBC today. And statistics show that close to 1,000 Jews signed that open letter opposing restrictions in the pro-Palestinian protests. And the letter was organized by the Jewish community, including prominent academics, lawyers, activists, highlighting their opposition to
crime skyrocketing, immigration's out of control, and now violent protests are turning UK cities into battlegrounds.
Fire was announced on Wednesday. Over 130 people were actually killed up till today for the last 3 or 4 days, when it was just mainly women and children. Why are people not understanding that? That is not a Hamas supporter. We're not supporting terrorists. There are not mobs.
Let's talk about the Jewish community for a second, because you've pointed to a small minority of them who may have signed this letter. But, anti-Semitism has gone up thousands of % since these
people are left wondering if Britain is becoming uninhabitable. That once stood as a beacon of order and stability now feels like a battleground. Constant protests, clashes, and an overwhelmed police force. It's a disaster unfolding in real time. Businesses suffer, daily life is disrupted, and the average Brit is left wondering when they'll get their city back. How did we let it come to this?
Which is whether these protests should take place or not. They have gone on now for almost 15 months. In the early days, the Met Police appallingly had a policy of appeasing so many on these protests. And when you appease people, you empower them. And we've seen the behaviour of the thugs attending this march just get worse and worse and worse, culminating today in 77 arrests for many, many offences, including assaults.
Hundreds of protesters have already been arrested, and that number keeps climbing. What started as a demonstration has spiraled into a full-blown crisis, stretching UK police to their limits. Officers are exhausted, overwhelmed, and struggling to maintain order as tensions flare. And where's Labour in all this? Nowhere to be found. Fumbling around, too slow to act, and too afraid to take a firm stance. Instead of real leadership, we're watching chaos unfold while the authorities hesitate, hoping the situation will magically fix itself. But with protests only growing, it's clear this isn't going away anytime soon.
It is time now to ban these marches. Their point has been made. The criminality is increasing. A ceasefire should come in place tomorrow. Enough is enough.
Fatima, look, Peter's got a good point. These protests have been going on for a very, very long time. Surely the point has been made. The ceasefire is done. Are the pro-Palestine marches just going to become as much of a nuisance as just stop oil? Because, we're blocking roads. We're costing the taxpayer thousands of pounds. We're taking the police away from solving actual crimes.
Despite a ceasefire agreement being on the table, the situation in both Israel and Palestine remains anything but peaceful. With hostages still not released as promised, anger is boiling over on both sides. Israel refuses to ease its military pressure, while Hamas continues to stall, deepening the crisis. International calls for a resolution are growing louder, but on the ground, frustration and violence are escalating. This deadlock is not just affecting the region, it's sending shockwaves across the world, sparking massive demonstrations in the UK and beyond. Protests have erupted on British streets, where thousands are demanding justice, but it has only led to further chaos. The situation is pushing the UK into a state of disorder. The big question now is, how long before this unrest spirals completely out of control?
It's not going to stop because this is against humanitarian law and international law.
But what's that got to do with Britain?
Because they are also being deemed as complicit in also supporting this. So at the end of the day, it is definitely something indirect. There's, sort of people that are also analysts that are saying that there are drones, there are weapons, there are lots of, money also being given by the support of the British government. So that's why there is a direct correlation to this.
There's growing outrage as some people directly accuse Labour of funding the horrific war, fueling tensions even further, wondering if this is how their tax money is supposed to be used.
Now that our judiciary wake up and hand down suitable punishments to the people arrested today, if and when they're convicted, like they have been doing recently with Just Stop Oil, we need stiff, deterrent jail terms to stop these people from bringing their thuggery to central London, affecting the economy, making London virtually uninhabitable for law-abiding shoppers, tourists, theatre-goers and the such like. The Met Police can ban these protests. They do have the power. Now is the time to do exactly that.
The UK government's stance on a ceasefire in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a subject of significant debate and scrutiny. At the same time, the UK government has expressed concern over the loss of life and the humanitarian crisis in the Israel-Palestine war. It has largely framed its position around calls for humanitarian pauses and an emphasis on encouraging both sides to de-escalate the violence.
And also, with disheartening, I suppose is not quite the right word, but to see yet another Palestinian march on Saturday in London, where thousands of people were waving placards, including some which said, we love Hezbollah, Hezbollah are not terrorists, we love Nasrallah, he's our hero, Hamas are not terrorists, watched by the police who have been told that they can arrest these people, but who continue not to arrest them.
Well, it is, you say disheartening. It's
For months, the UK government watched from the sidelines as pro-Palestine protests erupted across the country. What started as scattered demonstrations quickly grew into an uncontrollable force, with thousands flooding the streets, chanting, blocking roads, and clashing with police. Yet, despite the early warnings, authorities chose to stay silent, hoping the movement would fizzle out on its own. Now, the protests have spiraled into violent standoffs, with mobs overpowering law enforcement, vandalizing public spaces, and creating chaos.
I mean, these demonstrations on the streets, they are not just hostile to Israel, not just supporting the Palestinian cause. Now they're supporting the Hezbollah, as you say, a proscribed organization. Their support for it is illegal. But they are on the streets basically demonstrating their power over the state. They are showing that the state, from the Home Secretary downwards, feebly wringing her hands, saying this is all basically illegal.
The state is scrambling to regain control, but it's too little, too late. The failure to act sooner has only emboldened the movement, and now the UK is left dealing with a law and order disaster entirely of its own making. Labour's refusal to address the issues head-on has only added to the humiliation, revealing a sinister plan to maintain power at all costs. Their disunited front only deepens the divide, with many now wondering how they can still claim to represent the people while promoting such a shameful act of pushing Britain into uncertainty.
They can't understand, first of all, why the British state, as it were, why so many British people have turned against Israel in this great struggle that Israel is waging on behalf of civilization against barbarism. They can't believe that Israel is being abandoned in this way, and they can't believe that, far from supporting Israel and the Jewish people, October the 7th ushered in a year of unprecedented anti-Semitism across Britain, in Britain and across the West. But beyond that, they also can't believe what they're seeing, because they can see, and I can see very clearly.
The Metropolitan Police did make some arrests. One of them was a man allegedly caught shouting support for Hezbollah near a pro-Israel counter-demonstration. But let's be real, does it solve the bigger problem? The protests are getting more extreme and the authorities are playing catch-up when they should have been ahead of the curve months ago. Meanwhile, Melanie Phillips believes that they just can't wrap their heads around why so many in Britain have turned against Israel. And can you blame them? From their perspective, the UK has gone from being an ally to standing by while protesters flood the streets in support of groups openly hostile to Israel. It's a level of confusion that speaks volumes about just how much the narrative has shifted in the West.
Yeah, well, the war in Gaza has touched thousands of lives back in Britain, most directly, of course, those with relatives in Gaza or Israel. The conflict has also been reflected in and created divisions in British society and in our politics.
I won't let go till the end.
At this event for Israeli hostages in London tonight, there was a reminder that while the war hasn't reached Britain,
it's not just Palestinians who are rallying in the streets. Jewish communities across the UK are also making their voices heard. Many are calling for an end to the violence, while others are demanding accountability from both Hamas and the Israeli government. Among them are families of hostages, desperately pleading for the safe return of their loved ones who have been held captive for months. Their anguish is palpable as they march with signs, chant for justice, and urge world leaders to take action. The crisis has ignited a wave of activism, uniting people from different backgrounds in a shared demand for answers, peace, and the protection of innocent lives.
These are human beings. So Marie is a human being. My nieces are human beings. My sister is a human being. They all suffered tremendously on October 7th, and Marie has been suffering for 468 days in captivity. You can relate to that. You can show empathy towards each other, but you need to stop with the accusation games. We are not the politicians, we are not the decision makers.
for 15 months, the war has been waged on a political front here.
To my mind, there's only one way to describe those marches.
Some see it as a dangerous precedent, arguing that negotiating with Hamas will only encourage more kidnappings in the future. The protests are intensifying, with demonstrators blocking roads and confronting security forces. Despite a ceasefire agreement, the situation remains volatile, and the growing divide within the UK raises serious questions about its leadership's ability to manage both internal dissent and external threats.
They are scenes that are now happening daily in towns and cities across the country. In Bristol, there were clashes as police tried to keep apart a group of far-right protesters and a much larger anti-fascist counter-protest. It felt unpredictable, confrontational and tense.
And let's not forget Britain's own challenges, past riots, economic downturns, and a system that's barely holding itself together. The streets have seen riots before, and history proves that when lawlessness is left unchecked, it only escalates. So why is the government still pretending they can contain this? Every Brit watching this unfold must be asking the same thing: where does it end?
This is what residents saw after tyres and bins were set alight. By the evening, there was just the sound of the alarms in shops that had been broken into. The street littered with the debris of a rampage through the city. In Liverpool too, officers came under attack from a far-right mob. Here, as elsewhere, a number of officers were injured. Police in running battles with some of those in the city's streets.
People are starting to wonder, has Britain become a joke? Once known for its strength and resilience, the UK now looks like a nation struggling to keep its own house in order.
In Belfast too, a hotel housing migrants was the target, leading to clashes with police. More than 24 protests have taken place across the country. Last night it was Sunderland that saw the worst of the violence, its streets bearing the scars today. Northumbria police released these images of officers at a house where they believed some of those involved in the disorder were 2 people.
While other countries enforce strict measures against civil unrest, Britain seems paralysed. The world is watching, and it's not a good look. What's happening in this country is beyond alarming. The streets or tensions are boiling over, and yet the government still hesitates. How much longer before they finally admit what's obvious? These protests aren't just demonstrations anymore. they're full-blown disruptions. It's time to ban the marches before things get completely out of control. Every UK citizen must resonate with this because, at this rate, the country's law and order are hanging by a thread.
Anti-immigration riots and protests have swept across Britain in recent weeks.
The Britain I grew up in was the most peaceful, the most gentle, homogenous society that has ever existed. That has been destroyed.
Opinion polls show immigration is the number one issue of concern to the British public.
Do you think there should be more immigration or less?
Less.
Immigration has taken centre stage in Britain like never before. It sparked riots, protests, and political upheaval, especially in the wake of the horrifying murder of 3 girls in Southport. Some believe that there's no denying it. Migration has reshaped the country. It has also damaged UK's global standing.
Do you feel safe when you come here?
No, because there's a lot of drug addicts and drunks as well.
Do you feel you're living in the same country as you grew up in?
Oh, good God, no. No. I come from Camden Town in London, and even that's a League of Nations now.
How do you think immigration has changed Great Yarmouth?
I think it's changed it a lot because a lot of people are not coming, locals are not coming to Yarmouth.
Not too long ago, Britain had a strong national identity, a shared culture, and was largely homogeneous. But over the decades, the floodgates have opened, millions have arrived, some highly skilled professionals, others escaping poverty with entire extended families in tow. The change is undeniable. Leicester, once a quintessential British city, now holds the title of the least white city in the UK, with just 41% identifying as such in the latest census. Many Brits are asking, has Britain changed beyond recognition?
What do you think it's like to live in Leicester?
You got me with that one, really. It's not the best, is it?
Why is that?
I'm going to look round. What do you reckon? Hey, what's this?
There were some riots here a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember. What do you make of those race riots?
Every few years there's one. You know, that's how it goes. Blaring off steam and that's that.
Immigrants, crime rates, economic instability, Brits were already dealing with enough. And now, these protests have been thrown into the mix like fuel on an already raging fire. The frustration is real, and every citizen feels it. While the government stays indecisive, the public is left to deal with the consequences of their inaction. It's reaching a breaking point, and the people know it.
Being claimed to, Boris Johnson has said effectively, to all intents and purposes, Keir Starmer's standing with Hamas. Is that how you see it?
Well, yeah, I think there's just an appalling abuse, firstly by the ICC, which has broken its own rules in coming to this kangaroo court decision. There was no basis for it providing the decision. It was a political decision by a political court. And for then our Prime Minister and our government to suggest they're going to abide by it makes a mockery of the very international law values he claims he wants to
The accusation that Keir Starmer is standing with Hamas had sparked major controversy, especially after Boris Johnson's remarks suggested just that. The issue revolves around the International Criminal Court, ICC, and its recent decision, which some are calling a politically motivated attack rather than a legitimate legal ruling. Critics argue that the ICC has overstepped its bounds, breaking its own rules in the process. The court's ruling has been labelled a kangaroo court decision, lacking any real legal basis. And now, with the UK government seemingly willing to go along with it, some believe this undermines the very principles of international law that Starmer and his party claim to uphold.
Bad choice. He says the government is putting the UK's national security at risk of being, says that basically the government is being clueless over this issue.
Well, I think he's making a broader point about defence spending as well and what's going on. I think it's incumbent on the government to get to that 2.5% target on defence spending
and the rest
as quickly as possible. Well, and the rest, I think 2.5% is nowhere near enough, given the scale of the challenges we're now facing on the global scene.
Britain's national security is looking more fragile than ever, and even MI6's chief, Richard Dealer, isn't holding back. He's calling out the government for making reckless choices, saying they're putting the country at serious risk. And let's be honest, when someone like him says the government is clueless, it's time to start paying attention.
Information, is out there. It's not then shared with the public. People then jump to conclusions, and there is a basis for how societies start to fall apart. We need in the modern age We've got government, it needs to come out and tell us what's going on, not what people imagine is going on.
And I just don't think we actually trust what we're told anyway. That's the terrible thing.
Well, if we were actually told the reality of the situation with no spin, then we'd be in a different position. But the trouble is that people want to spin the data. That's the issue, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the biggest concerns is defense spending. The government claims they're aiming for 2.5% of GDP. But let's be real, given the threats we're facing globally, that's nowhere near enough. And the worst part, some of that so-called defense budget isn't even going towards actual defense. Instead, it's being padded with things like national insurance contributions. Brits assume that with all the wars in the world right now, the least the government could do is prioritize real national security, not just cook the books.
Finally, after 467 days of war, a ceasefire has been agreed between Israel and Hamas. Within minutes of the news breaking, there were celebrations across Gaza. They were dancing in the streets of Khan Yunis, a city that has been almost totally flattened over the many months of fighting.
All citizens feel relieved and happy with the news of the ceasefire, and we hope to return to our homes, villages.
When the ceasefire was announced, celebrations erupted on both sides. People were desperate to believe it was finally over, but little did they know, it was never a real ceasefire. It was just another pause in a cycle of violence that refuses to end. Those who thought peace was within reach were given false hope.
And in Doha, where the negotiations have been taking place, the Qatari Prime Minister said that they will work to make sure that the deal sticks.
We are committed. We will continue to do everything we can, everything possible, together with our partners to ensure that this deal is implemented as it's agreed. And this deal will bring us peace, hopefully, at the end of it. I believe that it all depends on the parties of the agreement and acting in good faith in that agreement in order to ensure that no collapse happening to that deal.
Let's be real, whether Israeli or Palestinian, these are human beings. They deserve to live a life free from war, just like anyone else. The pain, the loss, the fear, it's universal. While politicians play their games, ordinary people on both sides are left to suffer. How is that fair?
The deal will need to be ratified by Israel's Security Cabinet on Thursday. It is expected to be approved. Many in Israel are against the deal because it doesn't guarantee the release of all the hostages in the first phase, and because Hamas is not defeated in Gaza.
Today we affirm that the occupation has failed to defeat our people and our resistance. They achieved nothing but destruction, massacres, and war crimes against our people.
Despite everything, the hope for a real ceasefire remains strong. People still believe that peace is possible, not just in this conflict, but all over the world. It's a long shot. But if the world leaders actually step up and do their job, maybe, just maybe, we can stop watching history repeat itself. The UK government has faced considerable pressure both domestically and internationally to take a stronger stance on the issue. There have been calls from members of the opposition, civil society groups, and some within the ruling Labour Party itself for a more robust response on this matter. Some critics argue that by continuing to let the protest happen, the UK is effectively involved in the violence and is not doing enough to promote a lasting peace in the region. As tensions flare and clashes between pro-Palestine protesters and UK police escalate, one thing is clear, this is no longer just about foreign policy, it's about the values we uphold as a nation. The right to protest, the role of law enforcement, and the broader political landscape are all being tested in real time. So where do we go from here? Should the UK government take a firmer stance, or are these protests a wake-up call for change? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of the latest developments in the UK, make sure to subscribe. Together we can make Britain peaceful again.